I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Southwest Magazine. Of all the democratic nations in the world, Canada has one of the highest concentrations of media ownership. Out of all the Canadian provinces, New Brunswick has the highest concentration of media ownership. Joining me today to discuss this issue is MLA of Kent North, Kevin Arseneau. Thank you for joining me today, Mr. Arseneau.
With pleasure.
So you're concerned about high media concentration, in particular in New Brunswick. Can you tell me a little bit about why this is a concern of yours?
Well, I mean, it's always a concern when there's a monopoly on media outlets. It's always a concern. I mean, I think that the more media outlets that we have, and the more diverse information, credible information that we have, is very good for democracy. In New Brunswick, we have a unique situation in the whole world. People, I mean, there's been articles about the situation in New Brunswick, in Europe, in North America. We're definitely one of the Western jurisdictions that has the highest concentration for media in the whole world.
Can you speak a little bit about what that means for people at home who might not realize in terms of percentages? For instance, as far as newspapers go, how many of those are owned by the Irving conglomerate?
Yeah, so the biggest media concentration in New Brunswick is BNI. So it's the Brunswick News Incorporate, that's owned by Irving. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's very close to 97% of English written media, so print media, is owned by BNI. There's only a few, one or two media outlets that are independent in the print media sector. And then there's other, there's other in other kind of media. There's other kinds of concentration, but yeah, print media. We're talking about 97%, and that what happens is that your message can very easily be controlled. The best example, I think, to give towards that is the explosion that happened at the Irving refinery. The day after the explosion, the headline, instead of being an explosion and looking at it in a different kind of way, or analyzing the situation for what it was, the headline in the newspapers all across New Brunswick was, Thanksgiving miracle. And so that very much conveys, and if it was just one newspaper that saw it that way, but if you look at the other news outlets, either it be CBC or different radio stations, obviously that wasn't the headline. So when we talk about concentration of media, we also talk about concentration of the message, and concentration of the way that we're reading, or we're receiving the news as it happens.
Do you see an even greater conflict when it's, let's say, a company like Irving that isn't just involved in media ownership, but also has other companies, like you're mentioning oil, but when we're talking about coverage of glyphosates and they're involved in the forestry industry?
Absolutely, and that's why the motion I will be putting forward on Tuesday in the House will attack those two important things. So first of all, it's concentration of media. No media outlet should be tolerated to own more than 40% of the market, and still that's a lot, but we have to start somewhere. And so 40% of the market, not more. And one of the reasons for that too, that I did not mention, is the ability for these, once there's a monopoly, the ability to drive down advertising prices, and then kindly put away the rest of the media. So once you own a lot, it's a lot easier to put people aside and other media outlets aside. The second thing that the motion will be attacking is the fact that you should not be able to have cross ownership. And I think there's a big discussion that has to be done on that, because how does Brunswick News cover forestry? How does it control or cover the oil industry? How does it cover renewable energies in contrast? How does it cover transportation and agriculture? So when you have cross ownership, you're kind of able to construct the message that you want brought forward when especially when you have a business ideal in the back of your head.
Will you be also looking at the television landscape? In the TV world, there's obviously a huge problem with vertical integration, and we're the only province where all the private TV stations are owned by the same telecom companies that supply internet and cable services. So that presents another media landscape problem altogether.
Absolutely. And so that's why this motion is going, the 40% cap, and that kind of cross ownership. We have, there has to be different different models. This is not anything in any way that's we're not going to be the first to do this. These kind of laws do exist all around the world. They exist as close as Quebec. They exist in many European countries and many Asian countries also. These are just very normal ways of capping media, so that there's no concentration, there's no monopolization. And like I always say, I personally, I've never questioned the integrity of journalists that work for those outlets. That is not what I'm trying to do here. We have very skilled journalists all around that are working for these media outlets that have monopolies. But there's many other ways that you could control messages than the articles that are being written. Mm-hmm. And I think there's been a lot of writings on that, and we could go back. I think it was early 2000s. There's a Senate committee that had brought out a report saying that in New Brunswick that they were very worried about the media situation in New Brunswick. Mm-hmm. So like I said, in the early 2000s, I believe, a Senate committee had brought out a report saying that they're very worried about the situation in New Brunswick.
It's definitely worrisome, and I think the other thing that we should draw to people's attention is that Canada, I believe, has 4 times higher media concentration than even the United States. So, and that's Canada as a whole, but within Canada, New Brunswick is, I believe, the highest.
Definitely. I mean, we're I'd say, like, for what we call Western countries there, we definitely are the highest in terms of media concentration. I mean, New Brunswick is being looked at worldwide as a very high concentrated model. There was an article in Le Monde Diplomatique, which is one of the biggest news, very analytic newspapers in France, looking at the media situation in New Brunswick and saying that this is unseen.
What do you see as a threat when it's not just high media ownership? For instance, high concentration of media ownership can have an effect on true local news. How have you seen that become a reality in New Brunswick, where local news, be they papers or TV stations, have closed down?
Well, they can't survive. So, local news, I mean, there is some a little bit here and there of local news, and I'm always very happy to see, some local news outlets surviving. But I do know that the situation is not easy at all, and we've seen, just during the pandemic, we've seen, I believe, the one of the Sackville. One of the Sackville media outlets closed down, in we saw it everywhere. We saw some projects try to kind of have a grasp, but cannot survive in a monopolistic environment. And so some people tell me, yeah, but if you cap it, we're going to actually lose some media. No, 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 no. We'll gain media outlets because they'll be able to survive in the environment here in New Brunswick. So I think, I mean, like I said, it's a great thing for democracy, having a multitude of perspectives on some issues. And I think it will be good for local news, so very localized news, media outlets, but also maybe give more substance to the different array of media outlets that we have. So right now in New Brunswick, we do not have any media outlet that really takes the time to analyze, and we're mostly in news as it happens. And so, but by having by breaking the monopoly, then you give a chance to a diversity of journalistic approaches to be able to survive in the province. And I think that could only be good for the people of New Brunswick, for the province of New Brunswick, and democracy as a whole.
Yeah, and one of the problems working in Canada as a journalist, I can say from experience, and even working at some American outlets, is when they're owned by just a few people, the idea of reporting on the situation becomes troubling to a lot of journalists because you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. And oftentimes you find yourself having to go work for one of the few. How do you see this then working? Can we go from where we're at now in New Brunswick and even Canada? Can we take a step backwards from this high media concentration? Is that possible?
Absolutely, it is. It is, and we'll have to do it in increments. It's like anything. You don't make it happen overnight, but you could go in increments and let the market kind of get ready for it, and we'll see new media sources, new opportunities for a diverse media landscape develop during the years. And I think the first step, which I'm trying to do with this motion, is a discussion about it. I asked a question in the House actually about media concentration in New Brunswick, and the answer that I got from the Premier was basically, we don't have to think about that because anyway, everyone's taking their news on the internet. That thinking like that is I think a big problem. We need media outlets, credible news sources, and people that will that have that background and that bring the different approaches on news. And we need to make sure that journalists are able to do their jobs through these different media outlets. And like you say, I've heard many stories. I won't go blabbering about them, but I've heard many stories during the last 5-10 years about exactly what you said. People not being able to bite the hand that feeds them, and that's I think a major problem.
Yeah.
And many journalists have talked to me about, even if you don't get a phone call to say, you're going to write this with this angle, but you do know that if you write those kind of hard angles, you will not get any promotions. You will not go any further. You will eventually be the first on the cutting board when cuts come. So people know that, and so it's a very mesquite form of concentration of message. And many people do not know, but especially in print media, journalists do not choose the headlines of their articles. Those are generally done at head office. There's also editorial lines. that are not controlled. And in the BNI Irving media, we often see editorials that are not signed. And I think that is a very horrible thing.
And you mentioned that a lot of times we hear this argument a lot from the CRTC in particular that says that the internet creates this level playing field, but it's really not the case, especially if we look at the fact that Google, Facebook, those are American companies, YouTube. So it's still going, we're at a point now where those companies are controlling so much of the Canadian landscape that even the monopolies and oligarchies that we have in the media here can't really stand up to those companies. So it is a critical time to think about what is going on and how do we reorganize it.
Absolutely. And I mean, on the internet, there's algorithms that bring you to a certain news source. So, and that will, eventually bring you towards those different news sources. So, like you say, there's a whole other problem on the internet, but that's going to be for another motion or another bill in the House. I think, I've often talked about this. I think that the first thing we have to do with the GAFAs, so Google, Amazon, Facebook, and all these big internet-based companies, the first thing we have to do here in New Brunswick is maybe start taxing them, because they're not paying taxes here in the province, and so even their advertising is actually unfair competition with local news outlets, because local news outlets, you have to pay your 15% sales tax when you buy advertising with them, but you don't have to buy that when you buy advertising on Facebook or Google.
We've often heard the argument too from the standpoint of community television that the internet should create a level playing field, but because there are certain media conglomerates that control the cable services, they also control community television funding, so they're able to dip into that pot and also use that money and redirect it to their commercial projects. With that kind of scenario in mind, do you think there are certain media conglomerates that have too much say in the government?
Obviously, yes, I do believe that. I believe that even when we look at internet service, and media as a whole, right? There, like you say, there is different kind of levels of monopolies playing here, and it depends on the angle that you take. It is a shared competence between, there's stuff we could do here in New Brunswick, but there's also stuff that has to be done at the Canadian government level. And CRTC, as you know, is federal. But there are definitely these companies that, especially companies that have cross ownership, that do have very, very big influence on government, because if we just take the Irvings as an example, I mean, they have lobbyists on the Hill in Ottawa and in Fredericton talking about oil, talking about forestry, talking about trucking, talking about wholesale, talking about agriculture. I mean, they're there talking about all these, but in the end of the day, they are also owners of 97% of the print media in New Brunswick. It might be 93, so I'm not. It's 93 or 97, but anyway, it's
pretty big.
It's over 90%, and that is way too huge of a number.
Do you see, from starting this discussion, which I think is hugely important, do you see there being a first step that should be taken if we are to address this? It's quite a big beast to tackle, but I wonder what you think might be the first actual move forward beyond discussion.
Well, I think politically we need to have that discussion, and so that's why my motion in the House. But then I think the first step that we must take, at a government level, is announce that there will be a cap. There's right now it's a free for all, but there will be a cap on media concentration in the province. And will that roll out in 2 years? Or 6 months? I don't know. Those are details that could be worked. But definitely, I think we need an announcement in New Brunswick saying that there will be a cap on media concentration, and second of all, if there is cross ownership as a transitory kind of way of working these companies out of companies that have, like I said, cross ownership. I think that media outlets that do have cross ownership should need to disclose their conflict of interest. It be a little message at the bottom of an article or of a TV story, but they should need to disclose that there is cross ownership in their company, and that their company has vested interests, or their family has vested interests in this subject.
Do you think New Brunswick is often a province too when we're looking at, for instance, Bell and Shaw? When we're looking at our supposed local news, it often is getting reported back to Toronto or Halifax, so that this local news we're getting is really New Brunswick news for somewhere else. Do you see that as problematic to actually getting what matters to New Brunswickers to New Brunswickers?
Yeah, and I come from the Acadian community, and I see the same problem in the Acadian community. So Radio-Canada, which is the CBC side of the French side of CBC, they have great, local shows, but all the analysis, most of the day is coming straight out of Montreal. And so there's often, there was big events in New Brunswick where you're watching LDE, which is like CBC News Network, and you're not getting what's happening in New Brunswick at all. And so this, and I think in the Anglophone side, with the Halifax Toronto poll, there's definitely the same kind of problem. And I've always imagined and kind of played around with the ideal that it would be very interesting to have a New Brunswick public broadcaster, with the unique situation here in New Brunswick, where with bilingualism, it could be a beautiful way of breaking those two solitudes that we call, francophones often, I always say, being francophone and being anglophone in the province is a lot more than just languages, right? We culturally, we do not follow the same news outlets, we do not read the same books, we do not listen to the same music, and so and if we bring in First Nations into that too, I think a public broadcaster would be a very very creative and unique way to kind of break those two solitudes and bring people to really grasp not only the language but also the other cultures that we have here in the province, and break those cultural barriers. And once you're curious about a culture, then learning that language becomes a lot easier.
Well, we're always open to new show ideas at CHCO in any language, so spread the word. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mr. Arseneau. I appreciate you bringing this important idea forward.
Well, thank you, Ms. Hogarth, and very happy to be here with you.
That was MLA of Kent North, Kevin Arseneau. I'm Vicki Hogarth. I'll see you next time on Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO-TV, New Brunswick's only source for independent community television.